All right, so principles of marketing class. My hope here in this last portion of chapter 6, talking about consumer decision making. We had just 2 areas left to cover, and again, what we're talking about here in chapter 6 is consumer decision making is not done in a vacuum. That there are factors outside of just going through need recognition through post-purchase behavior that impact those things, and we talked about cultural and social as being 2 of those factors. The last 2 we didn't have a chance to talk about in class because we ran out of time. So that's what I'm going to hit on here. If you're following along in your slides or if you've printed those out, which I encourage you to do for both this online portion and in chapter 8, which I'll have posted as well. I have both individual and psychological factors as being the last 2, and it starts on slide 41. So if you go with me there to slide 41, we'll start with those individual influencers. And if you go to slide 42, it talks about gender, age, life cycle events, personality, self-monitoring. So a lot of these are going to fall into what I call, for both psychological and individual type of factors that you'll spend more time in psych class or in consumer behavior talking in more detail about. Some basic ones: gender. Obviously, there's some differences there in the way that we act and perceive things, and so gender has an influence on the overall decision making that consumers go through. Life cycle is one. If you look at slide 43, it talks about how people move through their life, through different stages of their life, and their decision making changes. Their interest in certain things changes, and there's no doubt that I can speak to that just being from a college student until now. Priorities change, why you make your decisions change, what you spend your money on changes, and so it goes through young single to young married without children, young married with children. We have some situations where there's divorce or you don't get married, you're older and married, older and unmarried. Those life cycle changes are individual factors that are going to impact your consumer decision making. And just even you think about when you're thinking about buying a vehicle, what you're thinking about now as you leave college, you're probably, I want something economical. I want something that maybe is somewhat cool. I don't know. Maybe that has nothing to do with you, and that's for somebody else, that's a big deal. And as you get a little older, all of a sudden, hey, safety is a bigger issue. I have kids, maybe utility. Okay, so a sports utility vehicle becomes something you want because you can travel easier, you can move things. Maybe depending on where you live, do you live in a city? Do you live outside? A lot of factors change, and you're thinking about different things now as an almost 40-year-old compared to what you guys are thinking about as 18 to 19, 20, 21-year-olds. And so those things are going to impact your decision making. And then we're going to go to things like psychological influencers, along with individual, your personality. I'm not going to get into self-monitoring. We'll do that in an upper-level marketing class. But if we look at psychological influencers, things that you want to look at here, this is skip to slide 45. Perception, motivation, learning, beliefs, and attitudes. We're going to start with perception. Perception really is how you perceive things, and there are a lot of tests that you can do where one person sees this, one person sees that. A lot of it has to do with how you perceive, or even physically what things you see through the stimuli that you come across. And so slide 46 just talks a little bit about selective exposure, selective distortion, selective retention. We may only remember information that supports our personal beliefs. And so we have a way as humans of, there's stimuli going on all the time, all around you right now, but you're focused, hopefully, watching this lecture and you're listening to me, but there are other things. There's other things to look at. There's other noises. Maybe you heard a little while ago, right away when I started my lecture, my son was crying in the hallway. So there are different things that you can hear and be distracted by, but you choose to focus on particular things, and part of that is going to be your perception. And so if you look at slide 47, it talks a little bit about the impacts of or implications of perception on what people think of price. Okay, and there's things like, well, your perception of price is dependent on what you see from somewhere else. Same thing with noises. A really loud noise versus something that's not as loud versus a medium volume versus something that's very, very quiet. So depending on how loud something is before or after, it can impact what you perceive that to be. Is it really loud? Is it quiet? Same thing with price. Same thing with advertising, what things people see and what they don't. Motivation is another one. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is almost in every psychology course that you'd ever take, and it's basically, we talked about it like human needs. We talked about needs and wants at the beginning of this chapter, but talking about human needs. And as we move from physiological to safety to social to esteem to self-actualization, the book does a good job of describing some of those kind of a hierarchy, meaning lower end needs versus the top of the pyramid. Basically, those needs that are wanting to feel belonging is a second one, but wanting to realize your potential. And so a lot of times advertising, they may try to hit on different human needs. They're not always just going to stay with basic human needs of physiological needs. Maybe it's safety. Maybe it's the Army. Be all that you can be. So that's laddering up on those human needs. The other thing to look at is learning. There's two different types of learning. There's experiential learning and conceptual learning. Primarily in this class, you're doing conceptual learning. So you're not doing through direct experience or something that happens, but you're learning about concepts, hence conceptual. Experiential learning, you're going to be doing it through experience. So it's two different ways to learn, and customers can learn in different ways as well. Beliefs and attitudes, I'm not going to spend as much time on that, and I don't think I have any test questions on that as well. But attitude is really a tendency to respond consistently, and a belief is non-evaluative. So again, that kind of gets into the weeds of psychology, and we're not going to spend as much time worrying about those things. So that just kind of gives you the final things as you think about consumer decision making, and how all those the decision that's made is impacted by a lot of things. And so that kind of concludes the concepts that I'm going to cover in our lection portion for chapter 6.